This video is one of a series of videos that I'm making at the moment, looking in a bit more depth at some of the aspects of the PIES 2.0 framework. Areas and issues that the new framework allows us to look more closely at that we couldn't really do under the old language. And for this I want to look in particular at one of the more complex, one of the more paradoxical in some ways, perhaps one of the more contentious areas, which is how PIEs and Housing First fit together. PIEs as an idea came out of a lot of the ways that we work in what in the UK we call hostels, what in the States will be called transitional housing, and a lot of the initial thinking around Housing First was that you don't basically need transitional housing. It's kind of not helpful for the client group that it's looking at. So how do these two, something that had its origins in transitional housing, how does this fit with a new model that says basically we don't particularly need transitional housing, or at least for the particular client group that we're focused on with Housing First. You may notice, if you look at the diagram that I'd used to show some of the areas that the new model allows us to go, that Housing First is in there, but it's relatively small compared with how big Housing First has become as a movement and as a motivator for change and innovation and development within the housing and complex needs world. And that's for two main reasons. The first is that many of the principles that are actually embedded in Housing First are expressed right through the whole of the PIEs programme anyway, when you're looking at things like staff training and support, working with psychological awareness, possibly having a particular psychological model, working with people's strengths. All of these issues are part of the broader PIEs framework. So for Housing First here, we are looking specifically at the bits that are unique to Housing First that you don't get elsewhere. And that's in particular the insistence on fidelity to two of the core principles of a Housing First model, which I would describe as being the unconditionality of the offer of housing. No, I'll do it the other way around, which is immediate or at least rapid rehousing, moving straight into a property with a tenancy, and an unconditional tenancy so that your right to be there is not dependent on adhering to any particular support program, or particularly to rules like sobriety and other such issues that you will sometimes find, certainly in many of the recovery housing services that they had in the States that developed in the 1980s and 90s. Sobriety housing was what users wanted because that was the issue that they were dealing with, and that wasn't working for the new population that was coming through, and that Housing First then was developed for. And we've got a lot of discussion of this in some of the other pages on cross-cultural dialogues. Well, you certainly could argue that those rules are the rules of tenancy and the rules of immediate rehousing are part of the three R's, the rules and roles and the responses of the system. So you could argue that they're actually just another example of that. But it is that particular combination that marks out Housing First, and so that's its slot within this much broader programme. But putting Housing First in the programme does also allow us to look at some of the other issues around where the PIEs and the Housing First ways of thinking might fit together much more constructively. And the thing I'm looking at in particular, the thing I'm interested in particular, is the nature of the building, the role of the building itself. Housing First stresses tenancy and permanency and the quality of support, person-centred and so on. The actual nature of the building doesn't come into it. And to my mind, that's missing something. When we look at what is actually being done in the name of Housing First, you'll find a huge development, particularly in the United States and Canada and in Finland, where the idea within Europe was first picked up and promoted. You find a really significant development of what's sometimes called single site or congregated housing. So individuals will have their own tenancy, but they are all together on the same site. And in the States, we're getting houses of 10, 12, 15, 20 people all living in the same complex, particularly when they have a similar problem that they're all addressing, such as the need to move off drug and alcohol issues. In Finland, even, we found some very large units. In Canada, they have a whole apartment block or a decommissioned hotel, all being used as single site occupancies. People have their own tenancy, the tenancy is unconditional, but there are a lot of other support services, and in particular there's a lot of social and community support available in those units. Now, if we ignore that in the model, to my mind it's like having described two sides of a cube, where there's the third side that may be particularly important and may be particularly important for particular clients. And we're not looking at that. We're not addressing that. It's not part of the model, and so it's not part of the research, it's not part of the evidence base. We are missing, potentially, a huge part of what people are actually doing that may be most important. There's been a certain amount of concern about how individuals placed in an isolated tenancy are actually far more vulnerable, open to exploitation, as well as loneliness and other such issues. And that does start to suggest that the question of scattered site or single site accommodation may be particularly important. My own view is that it almost certainly is, and that would be as true of permanent housing as it was of short-term hostel or transitional housing that we've seen, that kind of peer and community support, the building that you use can have a huge influence on the wraparound feel of the support, which is what some people maybe do need, and we need to find out who. If I was being more assertive, I think I would want to argue that the three sides of the cube is quite a useful way of looking at the whole thing. But to my mind, unless you're looking at the nature of the housing and the importance of community and community support, then Housing First can end up like a two-legged stool. It's missing the bit that gives it the stability for those individuals who need that. A two-legged stool is better than no stool at all. Better than a one-legged stool if you think of housing without support or support without the housing offer as being one. So support and housing together, that gives you your two-legged stool. That is what the Housing First model says it's doing. In fact, most Housing First services, so far as I can see, are actually putting a lot of time and attention into getting the building right and getting the community support right, but somehow that's missed. By putting Housing First into the psychologically informed environment, the 2.0 framework, I hope we can now start to address those issues that help to tease out what works with Housing First and when it works, and what the importance of the actual building is, because that was the bit that was missing in the Housing First model as it was described. It's not what's missing in the practice. In practice, people are very pragmatic and they know that they should do what will work, and so they do choose properties that they think are suitable, and they place in those properties the kind of people who they think would be suitable, would need perhaps additional support, time and so on. But it's not being looked at, it's not being discussed. With this new formulation about the relationship between the two, hopefully now we can start to look at those issues. So in the next video in this evolving series, we'll look a little more in depth
at the PIES 2.0 model, and in particular how the Abacus self-assessment framework, the PIEzazz as we've sometimes called it, how that may help us to look in a few of the other areas of Housing First that make the programme effective, when it works, where it works, what we can learn from implementing this programme in practice.